Greetings! Welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel and a big pile of cleanliness. We have made soap here over the last day and a half, and I'm going to teach you how to make this same batch of soap. This is a great way to make a wonderful product for your homestead. This old-fashioned lye and tallow soap has a lot of uses, from cleaning to washing up and personal hygiene to leather tanning, right? This is the stuff that you can use to make an imitation brain tan solution is this kind of soap. It makes a great saddle soap. You can use it as a wood finish even. There is a ton of stuff that you can do with legit old-fashioned lye and tallow soap. Also, this is made from free materials. I had to buy the lye. Yes, you can make your own lye from wood ashes, but that's a process in and of itself and not part of this video. This is commercial lye. So you have to buy that. But the tallow, I went to my friend who is a butcher and said, hey, I'm making some soap. You got any tallow? And they said, yep, I'm about to throw this out. Would you like it? I said, yep, so there's my tallow. I rendered this tallow in an earlier video. I will link that video in the end screen at the very conclusion of this so that you can go and see how I did that, the first steps here. But this one starts from rendered tallow and goes all the way through to soap, which is ready to cure for 6 weeks. You do have to let this cure for 6 weeks before you can try it out. Now, in this video, after I finish this little intro, it's going to cut to some technical information on how soap works and what goes into it. That is important for understanding how to measure and work with your materials and scale your lye for the fat that you have. You can use any quantity of fat, or in this case, I ran my calculations on ample fat and didn't have quite enough lye, so I cut the fat back a little bit, right? As long as you know how these ratios work and why you need certain ratios, you can scale this however you want and use any fat that you want. I'm approaching this from the technical scientific perspective, because here in the modern world, we're kind of skill orphans in a way. You know, 200 years ago, this would be something that every family did, and every family had their own favorite measurements and recipe, and it would just work because you just knew what those ratios were, how much lye you need, how much wood ash to extract, how much water to use, how long to dry it down, etc. Right? That was just intuitive knowledge that you would have built up from birth, right? Just watching your parents do this and then doing it yourself. We've broken that chain of knowledge in a lot of cases. But going to the scientific knowledge that we've gained in its absence, we can rebuild this skill base. So let's go. If you would join me for a couple minutes with my whiteboard up in the Nerd Nook, and I'll talk about what's actually going on when we make a batch of soap. If you will give me just a couple minutes of forbearance here to describe a little bit of the science behind this, it will help as I explain the recipe, why the recipe is the way it is, and how we make it. So if we start thinking about the main material in soap is tallow, lard, or vegetable oil. All of these are triglyceride fats. A triglyceride fat has two components. The first is glycerin or glycerol. They are synonyms. Don't let anybody tell you different. And that is 3 carbons and 3 hydroxide groups on it, OHs. Now, a fatty acid is a long chain of carbon. This is an organic chemistry shorthand where we don't show the carbon explicitly, but everywhere there's a wiggle in the line, you're assuming the point of that is a carbon. This whole wiggly thing is carbon and hydrogen. That's all you really need to care about. And you need to care about that because strings of carbon and hydrogen like this hate water, and that's the key thing. So this whole region that I drew in red hates water. Now at the end of the fatty acid, you have a carbon attached to 2 oxygen atoms, and this one further to a hydrogen. Okay? This is called a carboxylic acid group. That's why it's called a fatty acid, because it's fatty, because it has this long carbon chain, and it has a carboxylic acid attached. Right? Hence the name. Now, all you really need to know as a user and maker of soap is that the fatty acid group loves water. Okay? Now, when we take the glycerin and we combine it with 3 fatty acids, you get a triglyceride. Now, I drew a couple of different versions of the triglyceride. The most common in your heavy fats, your solid at room temperature fats, are just straight chain saturated fats. This is what it means to be saturated. It has the maximum number of hydrogens on it, and it is a straight chain. Okay? These are solid because since they're straight chains, they pack together very, very closely. That's what makes a solid fat a solid fat. But you can also have branching chains on your fatty acids where you have extra little, woogity carbon sticking off, this there and the other place. These tend to be more of your gamey tasting fats. So ruminants that are eating a lot of wild forage develop more of these as a byproduct of rumination. And this is where you get, like grass-fed beef or venison or sheep having more of a gamey taste and odor. That's from these branched chains fatty acids. And then your liquid at room temperature oils, they bend. They're no longer straight because they have these double bonds in them, which makes them unsaturated. Okay? So the more liquidy your fat, the more bends or the more branches. The more solid your fat, the more straight chains you have. And different species and critters and plants produce these at different ratios, giving you different textures of fat. Okay? So when we're looking at it at a hard animal tallow, this will predominate. When we're looking at a liquid vegetable oil, this will predominate. If you're using venison, you'll have more of this. If you're using beef, you'll have more of this, right? So it's all just a ratio of these different fatty acids on your triglycerides that give the fats their different properties. Now, this is what we render when we render the tallow out of our beef kidney fat. In that previous video I mentioned in the intro. If we take these triglycerides and we expose them to hydroxide, it will cleave these bonds, and it will regenerate our fatty acid plus our glycerin. So that's what we're doing in soap, is we're taking this final product that various species of critter and plant are storing for an energy supply and breaking them down into their original constituent components. Now, why does that make the not water-soluble triglyceride into something which acts like a fat? Something which acts like a soap instead of like a fat. So if you look at these, and these are just small representations of these fatty acids. Okay? Remember, the blue section interacts strongly with water. The red section hates it. So these want to ball up, point their water-soluble exteriors to the external of the globule, the fatty acid, the fatty chain interiors to the interior of this little globule. And because the overall shape of this is somewhat triangular, they tend to form round balls. Those are called micelles. Now, these small micelles are able to disperse in and interact with water because the water-loving component is on the outside. But when you think about getting your hands dirty because you were gardening, your hands are coated in natural oils, okay, produced by the sebaceous glands in your skin. Those will then encapsulate the dirt and make the dirt oily. So when you go and you wash your hands with soap, you have this oily little dirt globule. It can go inside, if I could draw, and interact with this oily region there, and then the whole kit and caboodle gets washed away. And that's how soap works. That's how soap works to clean you. So in order to make our soap, we're going to take our tallow, which is mostly those two. We're going to make a lye solution. We're going to mix them together, and we're going to get this back so we can do that. That's the soap making process. Now, the last thing I'm going to say here while I have the chemistry on the board, this feeds into how we design a recipe. The relationship between number of hydroxides and number of soap, of fats in our too soon to be soap, is what we call in chemistry a stoichiometric ratio. You don't need to memorize the word, but what it means is that there is a fixed relationship between these. You need 3 of those to break apart one of these. So when we're designing our recipe, we want to set it up so that we have that. For every unit of triglyceride that we want to break down into soap, we need 3 units of hydroxide. Okay, that gets important. Now, hydroxide will burn you. If you use too little, you just end up with, milky fat. If you use too much, this will burn you. So you want to use a little bit less of this than the triglyceride. That way you're sure that this is the limiting reagent. You run out of this first, you have a little bit excess of this, because this will moisturize your skin, this will burn it off. So, we want to make sure that we run out of this before we run out of that, and we have a little bit of this extra at the end of the day. So let's go start preparing our materials and talking about our actual recipe. Okay, so now that you know the basic science behind what we're going to do here, the first step is to weigh out our fat. We're going to make a 4 kilogram batch of soap. This is just lard that we're weighing out. This is beef tallow. You can use any lard, any tallow, any liquid fat. They all work the same. They will all make soap that cleans equally well. If you go online and you start looking up recipes for lye tallow soap, you'll see all sorts of, you need this much tallow, this much lard, this much vegetable oil, this much coconut oil. No. You're welcome to follow those if you want, but they all work. There's no difference in how tallow soap versus lard soap versus vegetable oil soap clean you in the finished product. Neither is more or less gentle, more or less caustic. Where there is a slight difference is when you use the lighter liquid oils, the soap will sometimes be a little bit frothier in appearance when you start to wash your hands in it. But that doesn't really matter. Seeing the foam doesn't mean it's cleaning better. Not seeing the foam doesn't mean it's cleaning worse. It's just aesthetics. Either way, you have fatty acids forming micelles, doing the soapy thing that we just talked about on that whiteboard. Okay? It all cleans you equally well. So use what you got. I'm going to be using 100% beef tallow, because that's what I have. Now, this tallow was already rendered. I did this on video a few weeks ago, and I will put a link in the end screen to the video for rendering these fats so that you can see the first step in this. These have been out on the porch, so they're very, very frozen, which is why I kind of have to get a bread knife in here to chop it up into manageable pieces. And this is not quite 2 kilograms. My scale here only goes up to 2 kilograms. So I'm just adding chunks until I get up to 2 kilograms. Okay, we're almost there. Stab that in. Almost there. Okay. Cool. So this is what 2 kilograms, which is just a little over 4 pounds of tallow looks like. So I'm going to add this to the previous 2 kilograms that I weighed out, and I'm going to put this on a burner on low. Okay. We want this to melt. We want this to get up to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so. It should be just uncomfortably warm, but not hot. That is important. We'll talk about that as we go through. If it ever gets hot enough to actually burn you, it's too hot. You need to let it cool down before you proceed. So I'm going to get this melted so I can do a final filtration of it and get all the last little bits of stuff out. And while this warms, we'll go and we'll prepare the rest of the materials. Now, in order to be able to use any fat that we wish, we need to be able to do a little bit of math to calculate how much of the lye we're going to add. This is genuinely important. Remember from the whiteboard, we need a 3-to-1 ratio for triglyceride molecules to hydroxide ions in order for this to work. But your sodium hydroxide ion is a whole heck of a lot smaller than your triglyceride molecule. Okay? It's just massively littler. So we need a way to relate these, and this is why measuring everything by mass is so critical when we're doing this. We relate these in terms of a unit called the mole. Now, I'm not going to go into a formal definition of this, but what it accomplishes for us is it allows us to relate number of molecules to mass of a sample. Okay? That's the take-home point. That's all you really need to know to understand this. And then they're related by a value called the molar mass. Now, when we look at our triglycerides, the common triglycerides range between 800 and 900 grams for every mole of fat. Okay? So if we take a kilogram of fat, you have to put in a number to start, so we just pick a number. A kilogram is an easy number to start with. And we multiply that by 1 mole of fat over 850 grams, and I'm just taking 850 because it's the average of the extremes. Okay? Is that literally true in every case? No. But you'll see why that's okay here as we go through. We're just going to make some assumptions. We're going to assume a starting mass. We're going to assume an average value for molar mass. And that tells us that each kilogram of fat is going to have about 1.2 moles of triglycerides in it. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, we need 3 moles of hydroxide ions for each mole of triglycerides. So we take that 1.18, we multiply it by 3, because this is our 3-to-1 ratio. And then we go and we pull the lookup value for sodium hydroxide, because that's our source of commercial lye, is sodium hydroxide. And it's approximately 40 grams to 1 mole. Again, we're just multiplying by the ratio. And that gives us a calculated mass of 141 grams of sodium hydroxide to equilibrate with 1 kilogram of our fat. Now, we're not quite done yet. This 141 would try to create a dead equal ratio of sodium hydroxide to fat. We don't want that. That will give us soap, which is way too caustic. Okay? If you do that, you will damage your skin. You'll get dishpan hands very, very, very quickly. Okay? So we want an excess of fat. We want to run out of sodium hydroxide long before we run out of our fat. So there's a varying range of values that people will use for overfat. It can be as high as 20% overfat or as low as 5% overfat. If you want a really super good cleanser that's really good at cutting fat, and dissolving other fats, you want a lower overfat. If you want a really gentle soap to use on your body in the shower, you want a higher overfat. Okay? I'm putting in 10% for this batch. So, if we just calculate, 90% of 141 is approximately 130. Yes, I know I lose a point for sig figs on some of those, but I don't care for right now. Now, if you're using other units, if you're not doing this metric, I recommend doing this metric. The math is so much easier. But if you want to use not metric, or you don't have a kitchen scale that has metric units on it, you can just estimate that 13% of the weight of your fat, that's how much sodium hydroxide you want. And then for this value of sodium hydroxide, I'm going to use 350 mils, which is about 1.5 cups of water. Okay? And that's a handy volume to dissolve the sodium hydroxide. Okay? It's not, if you have too much water or too little, it's not going to throw you off. Okay? It actually can play a role. We are hydrolyzing the fat. Yes, I know that in very technical terms, but you don't need to be concerned with having the water measured perfectly. Okay? A little more or a little less is just fine. So, I'm going to do 4 times 130 grams, and we'll get that ready, and we'll talk about dissolving this in the water, because there is some safety concerns here. Okay, so now we need to talk a little bit about safety for mixing our lye. This is just sold as a type of drain cleaner. It's 100% pure lye, and this is what I use for the soap. Okay. Now, when you mix this in water, it's going to generate an incredible amount of heat. So you need to do this in Pyrex is my recommendation, and I have this Pyrex inside a pot of additional water to help dissipate that heat. Okay. You always want your full volume of water, and then you're going to add the lye to the water. If you take and you have the lye powder in the bottom and you start dripping water in it, those first drips of water will flash boil and can splatter. Okay, that's bad, because this solution we're going to make is strong enough it can give you a 3rd-degree burn in much less than a minute. And if it gets in your eye, it can cause instantaneous and permanent damage. Okay, so this is glass. You can use stainless steel if you don't have glass, but you don't want to use anything else. And you want to be very, very careful. Okay, so we're going to pour this in carefully while stirring. You also want to make sure that you do this outside, because as it starts to boil, it will fume. You see it's starting to get warm. And you do not want to breathe in those fumes. You see it's starting to steam, even though it's in a pot of cold water in the snow. So we have just boiled the water, and even here on the outside I can smell a little bit of that, which I don't want to do. Okay, so even here outside I can feel the heat coming off of that with my hand, right? Even out here in cold water in the snow.
Exothermic reactions, man.
Exothermic reactions.
Crazy.
And we will always make sure we add an extra nerd quotient to all of our videos here at Old Ways Rising Farm. Come for the soap, stay for the nerd. How about that? Okay. So I'm just going to stir this until it calms down. Notice the gloves, right? Also, this is not something you want to do in your best clothing. Now, one thing that's interesting is that back in olden times, the washerwomen would usually, for whom that was their primary occupation, would make their own soap. And you could pick them out of the crowd by all of the lesions and burn marks on their hands from getting this on themselves when they didn't have the PPE that we do in modern time. Okay? So very, very careful with this. You want to make sure that you don't leave this sit anywhere that curious animals can get into it. We had to call in family reinforcements here to come grab the cats because they were being way too curious about what I was up to. Okay. And then when it stops smoking and fuming, we'll just set it inside the door carefully so that nothing gets into it. And I think we're about there. This is done doing its thing. You just set this aside until you're ready to use it. Now, when I got out my bottle, I realized this only has 450 grams of lye in it. So I took out a little bit of fat so that my ratio is consistent. That's totally fair game. You now know the math that you need. If you change the ratio, just change the ratio. Totally fine. It all just has to stay in proportion. Okay? So, let's head back inside and see how our fat's melting. So we have melted all of our fat. This took a couple hours. Go slow, right? Don't overdo it. Don't overheat it. And I can hold this pot anywhere I like. It's not too warm. It's a little bit warmer than body temperature. It's warmer than baby bottle warm, but it's not hot, right? I could stick my hands in here for any length of time and not have a problem. Now, I have spread newsprint across the table because this process has a very, very high mess potential. Okay? And the first thing I'm going to do is restrain this fat. When I rendered this, I strained it through a colander. But I just want to do one more little straining and get the last little bit of cracklings out. Okay. There we go. We did get a little bit out there. Okay. So, gross stuff go bye-bye. Setting that over in the sink. Now, it's time to mix in our lye solution. So before I do, note the consistency. Okay. Just for purpose of comparison, fairly thin, like almost like a light syrup, like a pancake syrup kind of consistency here. The change in consistency is going to be a very important clue to the progress of our soap. Now I'm going to take the lye, I'm gloved again, and the wearing of goggles is a very wise idea when handling this. Okay. And I'm going to pour this in while stirring. Be very careful not to splash this really nasty mixture. The water it was sitting in is just clear water. That's perfectly safe. A little water on the bottom is not a problem. Now what's going to happen here is the water's going to do a salad dressing on it. So it's going to emulsify. And it's going to emulsify because the first conversion to soap is going to happen quite quickly, and we're going to get a lot of little micelles in there. Now this is where the soap temperature comes into play. Or the oil temperature comes into play. You can already see there's a difference in the coloration. It's milky looking because we've made a whole bunch of small micelles. Okay. If the soap or the oil is really, really hot, that process happens a lot faster, and you end up making a smaller number of much larger micelles. Okay. The surface area of these little buggers is important. That's where all the chemistry is happening. Okay? So the lye is dissolved in the water. The oil cannot interact with the water. So where the water meets the oil, there's a boundary where a ion of hydroxide can go over and interact with a molecule of triglyceride. Okay? And at that boundary, make a little bit of soap, which then interacts with the water to form the micelle. Okay? So the smaller the micelles, the more surface area there is. The larger the micelles, the less surface area there is. The more surface area there is inviting those triglyceride molecules across, the faster this will be converted to soap overall. Okay. Now, you don't have to stir this absolutely constantly, but you do have to stir it consistently. Because what will happen if I just stop stirring, since the water is denser than the oil, it's going to sink to the bottom and this pot will stratify. Once that happens, you no longer have those micelles interacting with the residual oil, and it stops being converted to soap. Okay. So what we have to do here is keep stirring this, keep it agitated until it thickens as a combination of the chemistry taking place will thicken it, okay, and the cooling, the physical cooling of that once solid tallow will thicken it. When it thickens to the point that it's sufficiently stiff and will kind of pile up on itself, when you do this with the spoon, you see how it's not piling up on itself at all? When it starts to get thick enough that it can pile up on itself, at that point we can pour it into molds. Okay. So till then, we do the stirring, and the stirring, and the stirring, and the more stirring, and the more stirring, and the more stirring for an hour or two this usually takes. Okay? Now, don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with an hour of stirring here on YouTube. The algorithm would hate me for that, and so would you. So I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to stir and stir and stir, and then we'll come back when there's something to show you. Okay, so it hasn't been quite a full hour. This batch really set up nice and quick. It was nice. It was relatively cool when I poured it in, so we had lots of initial nucleation sites, and it's heavy oils, so they solidify upon hardening fairly quickly. You know, so this is just going really fast. It's not going to settle out anymore when you look at it. And I can see some things when I'm looking at it with my eye here in person that you can't quite see on film. But I can see the pattern of the little, you know, of those little micelles starting to harden up because they build enough soap. And less and less and less of the free oil around them. And if I make sure this is stirred up well, sticking to the sides a bit, also a good sign. But if I pick some of this up and pour it, you can see how it's clinging, and where it hits, where it pours onto the liquid underneath, it's kind of mounding up and piling a little bit. That's what we're looking for. Okay? So this will no longer separate, and if I wait another 15 minutes on this, I'm not going to be able to pour it. So that is the next thing that we want to do. I'm just going to set that in here, move this back a little bit, and we'll start to get out some trays. I like to pour this into trays like this to harden up. Now at this stage, you notice I'm not gloved any longer. This is still extremely basic, and this is currently way, way too caustic to use as soap. But it is now at the will make your fingers tingle a little stage as long as you wash quick. It's no longer at the will melt your skin off faster than you can get to the sink stage. Okay? So this is a lot, you know, this is safe to handle at this point without needing gloves. Okay? If you get it on you, you'll feel a tingle, you go wash, you'll be fine. That being said, it is still basic enough that you can see it piling up right there. That's what we want. Okay? This is still sufficiently basic that it needs to be handled in glass, plastic, or stainless steel containers. I did this one time and thought I would be cute and make a bunch of molds, so I got one of those regular mild steel with an anti-stick coating cupcake trays. It was a nightmare. Don't do that. It ate the coating off and corroded the metal, and I mean the soap was still soap, but it was a mess. It was a mess. It was a mess. It was really ugly soap. It had flakes of, you know, rust and corrosion sticking to it. It was definitely you know, post-apocalyptic Zombieville soap of some sort there, you know. That's not what we want. We want nice soap. Okay? Now, I don't add scents to this. I've had trouble getting the scents to be smellable when I've tried a couple of times. And I'm not sure if it's just I've been putting them in too soon and the lye is breaking them down, or if it's here, beloved, can you just set this somewhere on the other side of the table there? Yeah, so I can grab another. Thank you, honey. Or if it's a case of I'm a cheapskate and didn't use enough of the scent to matter, or if it's a mixture of both, but I just haven't had good luck with scents. And you know what? It's soap. It doesn't have to smell like anything. It has to make me not stink. You know, that's the goal, and this will more than do that. So I'm not going to need all of the trays that I have out here, but that's okay. Better to have them and not need them than have this solidify in its pot and be a pain in the neck while I'm chasing around looking for one. I mean, you can see how fast it's solidifying just as I'm working, right? Mm-hmm. When this really works, this is how it works. Now, if you have it too hot and your nucleation sites are too few and too large, it will still work. But instead of getting to this stage at 45 minutes and almost not being able to fill your molds before it hardens, it'll take 2 or 3 hours to get to this stage. And it will still be trying to settle out and separate even when it's at this stage. It will still soap. Okay? So it's not as though you need to think, oh my gosh, I ruined it and I'll have to throw away all that material. No. Just go with it. It will still soap. It's just not quite as pleasant to work with. And the finished bars are going to be a little bit crumblier. Okay, it's definitely not as nice a product.
Takes grease stains out of clothes, though.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. I don't think it neutralizes quite as totally either, and is a little bit harsher when that happens. Now, subject of that is these ingredients can only do one thing. The lye will hydrolyze the fatty acids, or not the fatty acids, but the triglycerides into their fatty acids. That's all that can happen. There's no side reactions, no chemical funny business, no weirdness, just that. Okay? So you're never out your materials. If you measure something wrong and have too much fat, it just won't suds well and it'll just, not really feel like soap. Okay? If you're on the other side and you have too much base. Remember I said if I were to stick my finger in this, it would tingle, I need to wash right away? It will stay in that stage, but it's not dangerous. So, what you can do, you can always just take it after it's finished, grate it or grind it up, mix it with another batch. Okay? So if almost done, let's say this batch had too much fat, I could redo my math. I could go back and I could make another batch with 5% over fat instead of 10% over fat. And then grate this up enough to soften and mix it with that and go 50-50. Okay? Or vice versa. If it never stopped being tingly and harsh, you can make another batch, maybe make it at 80 or 85% over fat, and then mix the two batches together, and you'll have good soap at the end of the day. I have not had to do that yet. It's really kind of hard to mess this up. But if you ever have a batch that you're not happy with, just make another batch and fix it. Okay. Now, I just need to scrape the rest of this. And while I'm doing that, I'll just mention the next thing that's going to happen is these need to harden up to the point that they can be cut into blocks. So that usually takes about a day. So what I'm going to do, set these aside. I'm going to wait a day, and then I'll cut them out, and we'll talk about finishing this up. See you tomorrow in a couple of seconds. It's the next morning. We poured these about 4:30 or so yesterday afternoon, and it's now a little after 8 the following morning, and it's time to cut our bars of soap. At this point, it's hard. I can't press my finger into it, but it's soft enough I can still dent the surface. Okay? And it's starting to get a little on the crumbly side, which you don't want. So it's almost, I could have cut this a few hours ago, but I was asleep. So that's okay. Now, this is not yet finished. There's still a lot of oil in here and a lot of water in here. I'm just cutting this into simple bars, and then these simple bars are going to be put up to cure for the next 6 weeks or so. Now, I got a little bit of this water on a little cut in my hand, and it burnt like fire. There's still quite a bit of base in this. So one thing that's going to happen is as the water evaporates, more of that oil is going to be able to access the last lye residue that's in here. Right? And that's going to both neutralize the last of the lye and react the last of the oils. Okay? And then in 6 weeks you can test it. Right now, when I get this on me, it still feels like it's leaving a soapy residue. Some of that is the lye reacting with my own skin cells, making soap in situ, right from the oils in your skin. That's why it's so harsh at this stage. Some of that is the oil residue in the soap. So when you get it on your skin here and wash it off, it's not going to feel like normal soap yet. That happens in 6 weeks. Then when this is all dry and hard and fully cured, you can take a bar and you can test it. You can see how it feels. If it is the way that you like it, great. If you want it with a little bit more harshness and more suds, and it came out a little too on the oily side, you can always make another batch with a higher quantity of lye to fat ratio, and mix the two and remelt them together. Okay. Same if it's too harsh, you can make an oilier batch and then mix the two together. I've had good luck with this. I haven't had to do that. Okay. But don't be afraid if you do that. If it doesn't come out quite the way you would prefer, it doesn't mean that you lost all of the ingredients in your batch. It's all still here. It's all still fat. And so you can mix it up with another batch and salvage all of your materials. Okay. So this is a fun project. It's a great way to use a material that's otherwise waste. This fat I just got from a butcher shop that was going to throw it away. So this was, other than the only thing I purchased for this was the lye. Okay. And, you know, so it's a great way to use up some things that would otherwise be tossed, and I hope that you will do this. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I would be most grateful if you gave it a thumbs up, because the YouTube algorithm loves when you watch the whole video and give it a thumbs up, and it shows it to others because it knows you enjoyed it. I hope that you will try this at home. This is all, please try this at home, right? Be careful with the lye, but try this at home. And I will see you next time at Old Ways Rising Farm.